Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Yes, we're excited to have you here. And I just want to say, if you have not already listened to last week's episode, I highly recommend that you go back and listen to it or watch it, because we are having Jeremiah and Julia, formerly known as the Sex Evangelicals, back on our podcast for part 2, where today we are discussing all sorts of things, purity culture in the present day. You know, so many of us have left it behind, and yet we see it in so many different areas, whether it's in our personalized relationships, social media, all sorts of things. And, you know, as I'm saying this is remind me a little bit of that conversation we had with Elizabeth Devon. Do you remember that podcast, Andrew, where we talked a little bit about this? Yeah, I'm really glad that we're having conversations like this where we're just, being able to kind of put some words and organization around how purity culture spans far beyond just no sex before marriage and really goes into areas that purity culture still plays out, even if we're no longer in a religious context.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I do remember that interview that we did, and I think that's always a useful conversation to be having.
Yeah. Awesome.
Before we get into the interview, I just always want to leave our quick disclaimer, and we recognize that some of the topics we discuss in any episode may bring up feelings, emotions, and triggers that may require more processing or be too much to handle right now. Please always feel free to skip any episode or parts of episodes and come back if and when you are ready. Our goal is to help you trust your own body and lived experience, so take what you need and leave what you don't. All right, now it is time for some of our listener questions. This question asks, every time I talk about sex in therapy, I freeze or dissociate. Is that normal? What helps?
Yeah, that's a great question. My first inclination when is this normal? I want to be really careful because normal is so subjective. You know, everybody's a little bit different. But what I think this person is maybe asking about is, you know, is dissociating, is freezing normal on a regular basis? Would that be considered part of a healthy sexual experience? And I would say, generally speaking, I'm just looking kind of through a trauma lens. I would say, generally speaking, being in a freeze or dissociative space really indicates either the real perceived or remembered threat, harm, danger, things like that. And so typically when we're in those states, when we're having sex, it means we're not in our bodies. Now, that doesn't mean that we're actually enduring threat in that moment, but it may mean that our body is perceiving something that is happening as potentially threatening, or, you know, for whatever reason, you need to kind of shut down your body in order for safety. And so I think that can then translate as well into when we even talk about some of these experiences, when we're reflecting on them, when we're remembering them, journaling about them, talking to our friends about them, things like that, our bodies can do the same thing. So typically, if I'm working with somebody where they are freezing, even talking about it in a therapeutic or coaching context, I might get curious about, hey, what's happening when you're actually engaging in these activities? Yeah, I might have some more thoughts, but I'm curious to know from you, Andrew, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with what you said so far. I obviously want to be careful when I say, like, is that normal?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess it's not abnormal. It's your body keeping you safe.
Yeah.
But I will say that is evidence that your body does not feel safe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so as I previously worked as a therapist, but as a trauma-informed coach who does a lot of this work, that is something that I would take note of. Like, it's not that there's anything wrong with you. It's just your body staying safe, but it's something to take note of and work with, I think. Yeah. Because the thing is, ideally, we would like to be in a place where we can talk about whether it be sex or pleasure in general, not even sexualized, but just in general, be able to talk about things like that, be able to tap into what our bodies are feeling and not go into an overwhelming nervous system response of freeze, dissociate, collapse, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm thinking too, I mean, I know between the two of us, you know, we do a lot of nervous system work, somatic experiencing, parts work, things like that. And I feel like those would be some really good modalities that we could use, or that I know either one of us would use with clients to kind of work through, like, what is the part of you that's freezing, or what is the physiological sensation even as you're talking? What are we noticing? Things like that. And so I think that if that's something you're noticing, going to a therapist or a coach, you know, who is trained in some of those body-based modalities could be really, really helpful, because oftentimes when we're in freeze or dissociation, we might not even have words to speak. And so all we're working with is the body and what is happening in the body. And we can use that even without words, even without having to make meaning. We can kind of help your body navigate through that and kind of resolve whatever's being held on to there.
Time for one of our listener stories. It says, I married a member of the church because purity culture told me he was the right choice. 20 years later, I found out he's a serial cheater and gave me an STI. If I had been allowed to date, marry, and have sex with men outside the church, this may not have happened.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That sounds very familiar to me. I don't know, Andrew, if you have had clients that talk about that, where just the lack of sexual experience or the ability to sexually explore can actually cause some pretty destructive and even like physically damaging results later on. Things like, STDs, STIs, unplanned pregnancies, things like that, because there wasn't sex ed, there wasn't time to, kind of engage in what might be considered a typical human developmental process when it comes to relationships and sexuality. Yeah. And I'm really sorry that this happened. And I think it can be such a gut punch to be like, I did all the things that I was told were right. And it turned out like this. And that can feel just absolutely devastating.
I agree. I appreciate this story being shared. And I know for a fact there are many people listening who will be able to relate to it. Yeah, it's interesting. I would be curious if there is actual research or what the research would show, and that is folks who grew up in like high control purity culture type systems, like what that looks like in terms of correlation to things like just infidelity or whatever the case. I feel like it does. Purity culture does tend to lend itself to different sorts of whether it's cheating or just impulsive, compulsive type, like use of like pornography, for example. And to be real clear, parenthetically, I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong, but the way that it is utilized, ways that are secretive, impulsive, and ultimately are causing harm, does, from my personal anecdotal experience, tend to correlate with folks who have purity culture backgrounds.
Yeah. Well, and I think, too, even our physiology is wired such where when we're told we cannot have something, like that can create more of a drive for it. And certainly that's not to excuse poor behavior or, stepping out on agreements that have been made, like in marriage, for example. But sometimes that taboo-ness of something can actually make you want it more because our nervous system can register that as lack and like in a survival state of like, I need to have that. I mean, that's like very simplified. But it is interesting when you shift the narrative and you're able to say, I could have this if I wanted to, but I'm making a choice because of X, Y, and Z reasons. It doesn't feel so much then like you're living from that place of lack or survival because you're going, no, I've decided, I'm choosing to be with this person or whatnot. And that lands in your nervous system very differently than here's all the things that you can't do. And then you're kind of on overdrive and oftentimes found in like a shame spiral as you're trying to push away all the, the bad things you're not quote unquote supposed to do. And then, only go after this very narrow prescription. I don't know if that's making sense, but yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about.
I know that this is an experience that many folks have had. And so you were absolutely not alone in this. And I'm just glad we were able to more openly talk about these things. We are thrilled today to be joined by second-time guests, Julia Postema and Jeremiah Gibson, also previously known as the Sex Evangelicals. Jeremiah and Julia are certified sex therapists, psychotherapists, coaches, podcasters, and researchers. Though their podcast is no longer putting out new episodes, you can still catch the episodes on their feed. They've been told by many that their podcast is where they give you the sex education that the church didn't want you to have. Julia and Jeremiah studied the impact of high-control religious groups on long-term relationship and sexual health development and relationships.
Welcome to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts. Jeremiah and Julia, it is good to have you back for a part 2. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. This is an honor.
This is great.
Yeah. If you're watching on video or soon you will hear, Andrew is no longer with us, not because he died, but because he had to do a client session or, as we like to say, go on a missions trip. So he is doing that. And so it is just the three of us, but the conversation will be just as good. And I'm excited. So for people who didn't listen to the first episode with Jeremiah and Julia, go back and listen, kind of setting the stage a little bit for what we're talking about today, which is purity tests, perfectionism, and power in relationships and the culture in general. So I think we should just get into it. How do you guys feel about that?
Do it.
I'm excited.
So I'm very excited for this conversation. There's been a couple times where we've kind of started to hint at this in some other episodes that we've done this season. But, one of the things that we miss is how purity culture teaches us not only to monitor sexuality, but thoughts, emotions, friendships, ambitions, even our doubts. And I'm just curious to know how you see that playing out in clients, friends, maybe even yourself, even like post purity culture.
The most immediate example that comes to mind is the paralysis that can sometimes still come up for me when I have a rare 1 or 2 hours on my own. I
Yeah.
will assess, okay, well, I could exercise, I could take a nap, I could catch up on work because I am never caught up on work, I could X, Y, or Z. And then I start this analysis of the pros and the cons and what choice is best and how will it impact tonight, but then also 3 days from now, but also the weekend. And that's not really an exaggeration of where my mind goes. And I suspect that the root of that paralysis analysis is the way that purity culture taught us such rigid ways of considering good and bad in a legalistic kind of way. And when when you learn that your sexuality has ties to eternal consequences, that does something to your psyche. And one thing that it does to your psyche is the intense monitoring of time and the intense monitoring of choices when sometimes the choice doesn't have an eternal consequence, and sometimes it might not actually matter what I choose. And stepping out of the decision making paralysis is hard enough. Being able to assess for myself, what does my body want in this hour? What do my emotions or my psyche need? That's a second layer of the work that's just as difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Everything in purity culture has to mean something big, right? Yeah. It can't just be like, no, I want macaroni and cheese instead of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Like there's a meaning to that. And it just puts so much weight on every decision that we make.
And mistakes can't be made.
Right. Yeah.
Mistakes are threats. That would be how I would answer the question, is that mistakes can't be made. And if mistakes do get made, either there's a call out or a cancel kind of response, or there's an expected atonement. However, the atonement and the effectiveness of the atonement is judged by the other person.
Yeah.
And the seriousness of the atonement is based on like my own sense of like rubric and self-assessment of the situation. Like this is what the church does. You
Yeah.
go down, you ask for forgiveness during the altar call, and you acknowledge. Like this happened actually at my parents' church some time back. Like, a pastor says, "Hey, you know what? Like I've been having relationships with another person, another woman. People come down, they like put their hands around him, they pray for him. Oh, we support you." 3 weeks later, he was fired. And like that's the way that mistakes get treated in purity culture. And we see that happening time and time again, particularly in progressive spaces.
Yeah.
What you've effectively named as the purity testing.
Yeah. And I was going to say that would probably be a good direction to go, is talking a little bit about that idea of purity testing. I know that, we've all been in like online spaces in various capacities for various numbers of years. And I think that have experienced or observed that purity testing, even if it's not connected to religious pieces, it could be connected to my own safety. Like, I don't like this thing that you've done, and how I feel is just, uncomfortable in my body. So therefore you are bad because you caused this in me. Or it could be that you didn't deconstruct in the way I did, or you didn't land in this specific spot politically or socially or whatnot. And then I'm judging you by these standards and consequencing you as a result. So Yeah, I mean, I kind of named a couple of those, but I'm curious to know if you have seen any more examples of that purity testing that people do either to themselves or others. And we see this in wellness culture too, a lot of purity testing there. Yeah, just what are some of those things that you see coming up that are the same as purity culture, just maybe with a different face?
Well, I think that the example that you gave around social media, the other element of this is that communication happens as an avatar, which is a virtual representation of ourselves, but it isn't actually ourselves.
Yes.
When
Yes,
I
that's
make
great.
comments on Instagram or Substack or whatever, like that isn't actually me talking. It is kind of me talking, but the I probably wouldn't say what I would say as I would type it out. There's zero nonverbal communication in virtual communication. So our brains are, which are wired to evolutionarily survive, interpret most of what we see online from a negative
Yeah.
kind of threatening kind of perspective. We treat the other as other. We don't give people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, I mean, the link, Jeremiah, that I'm making between what you're saying and purity culture is that in purity culture, not only did we monitor ourselves, but we learned to monitor other people.
Yeah.
So my youth group leaders would ask me questions about my sexuality or ask me questions about how often I was praying or reading the Bible. And they monitored my behavior in that way under the guise of love and support, but it was really policing. And I learned to police the behavior of other people too.
Yeah.
So, what you're describing, Jeremiah, on social media is the policing of other people's behavior in a very rigid, non nuanced kind of way, in a way that also lacks curiosity. And evangelical folks notice it in other people, but so often the developmental gap is the lack of personal self-reflection. The
Yeah.
progressive or seemingly progressive evangelical space can be quite cruel. One
Yeah.
of the reasons that Jeremiah and I transitioned our social media into Substack was because of the purity testing that we continued to experience and witness on other platforms, which is not a criticism of other folks being on platforms,
Right.
but we, as an evangelical community, have a lot of work to do around the ways that we police other progressive allies, because sometimes we do it in the same way that we policed our
Yeah.
peers' sexuality or our peers' spirituality.
Right, because from my perspective, like the perspectives that I have, the takes that I have, like they're consistently evolving. A
Yes.
position that I held 18 months ago is not going to be the same position I held today in quite a few different areas. And that doesn't mean that I'm right or wrong. It just means that like I have new information, I have new experiences that inform where I'm at right now. And in a purity culture space, to go back to what I was saying earlier about mistakes, is that if you make a mistake, you're disposable.
Yeah, that's true.
The pastor at the church made a mistake. Okay, he talked about it, he owned it. 3 weeks later, he's gone.
And a mistake is not the same as an abuse.
That's right.
And
Right.
I
Yeah.
think that,
That's right.
in purity
Yeah.
culture context, I can't tell you how many times I've read books in which a Christian author will say things like, the sins of pornography use, premarital sex, crossing sexual boundaries,
Bestiality.
and sexual abuse. Bestiality too.
Bestiality.
And every time I read something like that, I say those are not equal.
That's right.
Now,
Right.
I would say all of those things, aside from abuse, are not sinful behaviors, but these Christian high control contexts lump everything together. And I think in progressive spaces, a type of purity testing is that if someone makes a mistake, a human mistake, they have failed in this massive way and they're no longer
Yeah.
trustworthy, which is just so heartbreaking and maddening to me, because that is exactly what evangelical cultures did. A mistake is not the same as abuse, is not the same as a violation. And we have to be able to hold a little bit more nuance as we navigate our humanity, because we are all human, constantly figuring it out together.
That's right.
Are y'all familiar with the concept of the Panopticon?
Yeah.
I'm not.
So it's this for anybody who's not familiar, look it up, but it's a design basically of this like prison system, and it's this kind of shape where all of the prison cells are facing inwards. The door is facing inwards, kind of in this circle, and in the very center there is this guard shack where the guard can see out, but the prisoners can't really see in because of the angle that it's at. So you never, in this jail cell system, they don't lock the doors because they never know where the guard is looking. And so they end up policing themselves and each other. And it's such an interesting analogy, both to high control religion as well as even some of these more progressive spaces where you're never quite sure, who's looking, who's watching. So you're doing the policing of yourself and other people to try to monitor, to try to, arise to this standard of whatever the behavioral standard is. And it becomes this like very shame inducing, very anxiety producing system where I'm constantly being afraid of who is going to see me. And so I have to, act in a certain way so as not to be punished. And it just strikes me like what you're describing, even with the mistake piece, is that, you can't make a mistake. You never know who's watching. You don't get to be human. And there's so much that goes into that, but that all is part of that purity testing.
And the book that you're referring to, that Foucault talks about this in,
Yeah.
is Discipline and Punishment.
Yes. Yeah. And it was for a society. Like how do we do this? Basically a self-policing society. And yeah, it turns out that that's not too fun to be a part of,
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet I do agree with you in that I see, it seems so obvious in a lot of religious spaces, but I think when we're talking about where does this come up in non-religious spaces or post-religion, this same thing is happening where you have this individual standard that others are supposed to ascribe to based off of only yourself. And then if you haven't met my standard, I punish you based off of that.
That's right.
Which is not too fun. Yeah.
Right.
Which is the dynamics in the political system within purity culture.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We haven't given ourselves the ability to be human or other people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yes, to use your example, Jeremiah, if a pastor is abusing children within the youth group,
Sure.
of course, yes,
Totally.
that is a fireable offense. However, that is an aberration. That is not a mistake, and we haven't quite been able to get out of the legalism of all mistakes equal egregious sin.
And not just the mistake piece, but but this particular pastor gave a public apology that was like pretty heartfelt, but other people ended up being the judge as to whether or not it was authentic.
Right. Yeah. One of you said, I can't remember which one, said something about that self-reflection piece, like that's missed in some of these developmental milestones, and that then we see it in the way that we interact with other people. I wonder, can we expand on that a little bit? I think that's a very interesting concept that fits really well with our conversation today.
I think I was the one who mentioned that. I'm reflecting on something that we discussed in the first interview, which was the hyper focus within high control religious contexts on behaviors versus values. So premarital sex as a behavior versus consent as a value. What I think gets in the way of self-reflection is the policing of behavior. This person said X, Y, or Z, or did X, Y, or Z, or I said X, Y, or Z, or I did X, X, Y, or Z. I am very good at policing myself. However, the behavior focus doesn't allow us to actually consider, okay, what was I thinking when this happened? What was I feeling? What was the appeal of this? How did I negotiate it with self or others? I wonder what the other person in, let's say, a friendship dynamic or a family or someone that we don't know online, I wonder what they might have been thinking, feeling, or experiencing. The hyper focus on behavior limits empathy for ourselves and others, and it limits the exploration of values that allow us to engage like, way more nuance in the like spheres in which we live.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah. I wonder if we can move a little bit into some of the perfectionism. We've kind of touched on it a little bit here and there. But what do the two of you see as the connection between purity culture and perfectionism, especially when we're talking about roles or, the good girl, the good wife, the good man, what is that connection there?
A purity culture is about enacting a particular script, typically a gender script. When we study purity cultures in other contexts, both inside and outside the Christian world, it's typically around gender, the performance of specific gender roles. And so even the examples that you gave, good girl, good wife, that's following a very specific script of what women are supposed to do. Good man, good Christian, strong man. That's something that I often hear from men. That's performing a particular way of operating as a man, which is very different from, well, who are you as a person? What are your values? What are your interests? What are personality traits that you really enjoy, that bring a lot of life to you? And what happens if you develop an ethic based off of that? And then you can find folks that you have commonalities with, or you can find people that, hey, I do this a little bit, you do this a little bit. Let's figure out how we can merge and do a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, purity culture is all about performing the script that you described, Jeremiah. So I would argue that perfectionism is baked into
Perfectionism.
purity culture. Purity culture can look different in different communities. I grew up in a purity culture context in which not only was vaginally penetrative sex, because that was the definition of sex, not only was that sinful before marriage, but any type of sexual contact, maybe even hand-holding, which is not necessarily sexual, was sinful. So it set up this idea that, well, not only are you supposed to save this very specific behavior for marriage, but actually, if you really want to do it well, then you will avoid crossing any boundary. You will be, to use a biblical phrase, above reproach. And so, I mean, the idea of purity culture in general is highly problematic for a lot of different reasons. And in addition to that, it doesn't hold really any flexibility. And so being able to give ourselves the permission to let go of some of that perfectionism, to create our own standards, to give ourselves the grace to be flexible or to try something and not quite get it. I mean, that is a really hard thing to undo, even after you've undone the sexual messages.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that goes back to what you were saying in the first part of this episode with just the way it's baked in. You just cannot pull that apart from religion, and it just encompasses every part of really who we are, and the perfectionism piece that fits. And it fits even with what we were just talking about in terms of, making a mistake does not live up to that perfect standard. And so when that's why mistakes can be so grave, because it misses that mark, that's why it's a sin, whatever, misses the mark, of perfection that we're supposed to be able to achieve in Christ. Oh gosh, I don't even like saying those words.
As opposed to viewing mistakes as learning opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember early in my own process of deconstructing, how much relief I felt just to live as a human and make mistakes and it not be the end of the world, but also then in that recognizing how difficult it had been to live the first, almost 30 years of my life, fearing that a simple mistake that really has no moral values whatsoever, like I dropped this container of yogurt, right? But that somehow had like this eternal, significance, right? And like that, when you kind of sit with both of those, you're like, wow, that's a lot to live with, a lot to be, that's a heavy weight to have, that mistakes can equal that enormous of a consequence.
Yeah, it is a really, really heavy weight.
So how would you say that some of this internalized purity logic kind of shows up in things like sexual performance anxiety or compulsive emotional caretaking?
I think another element of purity culture or psychology is the binary, is that you enter into a decision by thinking about, okay, what's the right decision? What's the wrong decision?
Yeah.
And so some of the ways that that shows up in sexual health and relational health are around, am I going to have an orgasm or not?
Yeah.
Are we going to have sex or not? Sex equaling, of course, vaginal intercourse, like that in and of itself is a purity culture idea. That sex is related to, there's your genitals and then there's the rest of your body.
Yeah.
And as opposed to starting at this from, I want to try this thing, like what are the potential options that I have? What are the possibilities that I have for how this could go? Can I give myself permission to, either with myself or with other people, talk for a few minutes about what those possibilities might be?
Yeah.
And then once I've laid out some options, okay, I actually think this might be the route that I take.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, I had mentioned in the first episode that something I still find challenging is the way that I monitor my own sexuality in relationship. So, Jeremiah, if I'm in a sexual relationship with you, which is the case right now, I still notice that I'll be doing anything, cooking dinner, brushing my teeth, and I'll think, when was the last time that we had sex? Okay, that's whatever the timeline. That's probably too long. So I should probably initiate sex. So one, I'm focusing on like my worth as a partner based on sexuality, not based on all the other markers that are important for a relationship. And I'm also defaulting to what I perceive Jeremiah's sexuality to be. I'm defaulting to this idea that, well, clearly if we haven't had sex in X number of time, then he wants it. He's probably starved for sex.
Starved.
Right.
Starved, yeah.
Yeah, rather than asking myself, am I interested in sex right now? Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. Those messages are still like very baked into the psyche, and I have to work hard to catch them as they come up and to reframe my own narrative around that. And I hear that like
hear that a lot of
often
couples,
from couples.
Yeah.
And the relational impact of that, and I hear this dynamic with couples too, is that if you're initiating sex because you think I want it, like I am aware of that and can pick up on that and can pick up on, oh, like you're doing this because you think that this is something that I want as opposed to this being something that you want. And that impacts a sexual experience. A sexual experience in which both of us are in it because we both want to be a part of it is a different one than a sexual experience, than the emotions around a sexual experience, where one person is in it to try to please the other person.
I mean, I'm just thinking about how many messages I've heard from, women speakers in the church and honestly, even outside of the church too, of like, just start and then you'll want to do it. Right. Or it isn't about you. It's about, it's what is it? Holy, not happy. Right. And like, you just do this because this is an act of love and sacrifice. And it really is then teaching you to override what your body cues are or are not, in order to favor another person. And that's not to suggest that we can't do things for other people, because we know they like them. But yeah, when it's at the expense of our own selves, that's where it can become dangerous. And yet purity culture is all about that, override. Don't even consider yourself, especially if you're a woman, it's all about, making sure that the man has enough sex for his ravenous appetite.
That's right.
Right.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Before he cheats and before you write a Dixie Chicks song about it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. When we look at it, kind of that purity logic in the context of like compulsive emotional caretaking, which I think maybe impacts women or those socialized female maybe a little bit more. I wonder, how do you see that purity logic kind of show up even after leaving?
We talked about monitoring relationships from the perspective of policing behavior. Folk socialized as women may also have the tendency to monitor how well am I being that caretaker. And I am someone who really values being a caring person. So with my clients and with my friends, I want to show up as a caring person. So if I am checking, let's say, my text messages to make sure I responded to someone who's really important to me, that's fine. That's holding myself accountable to be the friend, the therapist, the partner, the family member that I want to be. However, if I am holding myself to this standard that I need to show up and I need to override my own self-care in order to be a good friend, to be a good therapist, to be whoever it is, then that might be problematic. Here's something that I have found to be really helpful for myself in monitoring that. I will ask myself, if someone makes a request of me that might be a stretch, I will ask myself, will I resent myself or this person when the task comes? So for example, I typically don't see clients in the evening on Friday. I am seeing a couple later in the evening on Friday. And in the past, in my baby therapist years, I would have been like, well, of course, this is the only time that they can meet. I will definitely meet Friday at this time of the evening. And I will definitely do that 6 a.m. session as well, because of course, my clients need me to show up and my friends need me to show up. And I can't cancel on my friend last minute, even if I'm having my own mental health crisis. Like, I have to show up. And so what I will ask myself now, if someone makes a request, is, okay, when I get to Friday evening, am I going to resent myself for overriding my own boundaries? Am I going to resent a client? Am I going to resent my friend? For me, typically I'll resent myself. I'll resent the fact that I probably knew deep down that this wasn't a great idea, but I fed into the narrative that I have to show up as a caretaker whenever people want me or need me. And now this evening, when we're done with our call, I can say, okay, I thought about this in advance. I made the conscious choice to extend this boundary, and I can happily do that.
That's such a good,
For me, because it's hard to assess, right?
Yes.
Like, getting
Yes.
into compulsive caretaking doesn't mean that we don't sacrifice. I think so often I have a negative connotation with the word sacrifice because of the church, and the good relationships
It's an important
do
relational value.
require sacrifice. So I make sacrifices all the time and people make sacrifices for me, but we have to figure out how we can make sacrifices without losing ourselves.
Right.
Yeah, boundaried for
Much
sure.
better.
Yeah, I think even like the imagination piece of like imagining how will I feel, or if I took this off my calendar or schedule, like your body still has a reaction to that, and gives you information that's super helpful. I think of things a lot through like a physiological lens, but I'm curious to know from the two of you, like, why do you think it is so easy to carry over all of these purity culture narratives, practices, tendencies, even after you've left?
I think when you give something eschatological consequences, or when you say that you're going to hell if you don't do this, like that tends to sit with you. It tends to grow some roots in your human psyche that are especially hard to dig up. When there are, when we see the ways that the church responds to people who make who respond to certain people who make mistakes. Not all people who make mistakes.
Yeah,
Because some
true.
people can have the privilege to make mistakes, and folks will look the other way. But
Yeah.
think about like your accountability groups, for instance. And hey, I watched porn the other day. The reaction from the group, the immense amount of, oh my gosh, Jeremiah, right. Yeah, are you okay? Just the sense of communal overreaction to mistakes, and I'll put
Yeah.
mistakes in quotes for the watching porn element. But the sense of overreaction, like our bodies get used to that. Something that steps out of the line, that steps off the beaten path, and I know that I'm going to get some sort of a big response from someone else, and so
Oh, yeah.
trying to be in relationships, and because of the way that mirror neurons work and all of that, like we anticipate that.
Yeah.
Anticipate
That's
that.
such a that term that you use, that communal overreaction, that really resonates because I mean, it's if that's what we're used to getting, like that becomes our familiar, even if it's not the healthiest thing, and we expect that from others and to give that to a true mistake outside of that system. That makes so much sense. That's a great way of putting it. Yeah. Well, I want to move a little bit into kind of some of the healing aspects of, how do we navigate relationships after high control conditioning? So, the two of you work in, in sex therapy, relationship therapy. So, what are some of the things that you feel like it looks like, or what might it look like to build sexual and relational connection that isn't based on those implicit purity testings, especially in long-term partnerships?
Couple things come into mind. One, in relationships, and in two people relationships, there are three things that are going on. There's what the relationship needs, there's partner A, what partner A needs and is doing, and then there's what partner B is doing. And all of these are kind of interconnected with each other. And so making sure that the relationship isn't just about the agreement itself, but it's also about what are each individual person doing to work towards that agreement, either the shared goal or the individual goals that we have. When I was thinking about that question, I was also thinking about this idea of authenticity. Authenticity is another word that kind of gets thrown around in like Gen Z lingo that, that actually gets back to what I was saying about, well, if I take accountability for my mistakes, and if I do it in this public setting, like, was it authentic, quote unquote? And then it becomes into like vibes and kind of emotional control from others. I really like what the philosopher Martin Heidegger has to say about authenticity. He says that authenticity shows up in three ways. One, committing to your own actions in the world. So when I say I'm going to do something, I do it, and if I don't do it, I have some sort of way of like conversing with another person to make sure that there's the language I use is like a rain check policy, some sort of way that I'm going to come back to it. Two, the courage to recognize and act upon one's possibilities. So, for instance, I did a really courageous thing. You and I both did a courageous thing in leaving New England, leaving the community that we had here, and moving to North Carolina with the hope that there will be more opportunity to do some of the work that we want to do in person. Is it the right decision? I don't know. To be determined. Could be. At this particular time, that's not especially relevant, because the important thing that I did was that you and I made a courageous decision. We looked at what our possibilities were. We made a decision with the best knowledge and resources that we had, and took a leap of faith. The third thing is, once acting, accepting the responsibility and potential consequences that come with those decisions.
Wow.
I really like that kind of three-pronged approach to kind of rethinking what kind of our responsibilities are within the relationships that we have. That it isn't just how do we kind of form particular types of gender roles and make agreements based off of kind of what the church tells us we're supposed to do according to the gender agreements that we have, or we're married, so we are inherently monogamous. So make sure you don't, It's not about that, but I really like thinking about committing to your actions in the world, making courageous decisions once you've kind of figured out what your possibilities are, and then accepting and owning the responsibility and potential consequences. Like that is a framework for helping to, well, if we make that our goal, well, then how does that then change the way we do relationships?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think what the two of you have been saying multiple times in multiple ways of like moving from the performance, good, bad, right, wrong, that sort of thing, into the values based, or, values foundation. That is just a totally different way of relating to other people and existing in the context of relationships, even non-romantic relationships.
Sure, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what are some tools that you work with or that you use when you're working with couples who are kind of trying to move from more of that conditional, love and, obedience and performance, to more of a unconditional love or embodied consent, values driven relationship?
Something that I still struggle with is, how can I be accountable when I make mistakes without moving into self-flagellation or self-loathing? Because that is so baked into purity culture, confessing your sins, confessing it to God, confessing it to your community group, and going through whatever penance prescribed to you. So I notice sometimes in any relationship, but especially with you, Jeremiah, that when I recognize, oh, wow, I did not live according to my values, that is not the person that I want to be in this world or in this relationship, I have said to you, well, I don't know how to be okay with myself or with you with an apology and a commitment to doing something different. Like, that doesn't seem like enough. It doesn't seem like I've, really dug into like how bad and broken I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and something that, like, language that I found helpful for myself or for some of the couples that I work with is like resolution and repair. So rather than like forgiveness is important, but sometimes that comes with some loaded connotations. So rather than forgiveness and self-punishment and whatever kind of penance you do, I think it can be really helpful to say, like, okay, well, what's the resolution here? Was I able to hear your perspective and how what I said or did hurt you? Was I able to reflect back that I acknowledge that? Was I able to share something about myself that might have contributed to the problem, not as an excuse, but so that you can better understand me? You come to an agreement about what happened and what both of us can do differently. Okay, great.
Yeah.
That can be it. And then moving to repair is a way that, whether it's a partner or a friend or a family member, like, how can you reconnect in a way that feels close, in a way that allows you to remember that this relationship is solid and secure even when one or both of us makes mistakes. So giving ourselves both a new process and a language to be human with ourselves is one way that I have found helpful to rewrite the, like, intense shame spiral that many of us can probably relate to when we fuck up, because we will fuck up. We do
Yeah.
quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of the human nature, but I love that because it doesn't feel as like jarring as, what we talked about with like making mistakes. There's this consequence. And I think when we haven't untangled how purity culture or fundamentalism lives inside of us, you're like we've talked about, it's so easy to just replicate that and really create a lot of disconnection in relationship, but that never gives us a way to move forward. It means that the relationship essentially has to end. Like, once somebody makes a mistake, somebody has to be right and somebody has to be wrong. One person wins, one person loses, and potentially then we're done. There's no room for reconnection. And I think what you're suggesting is such a different path. It's not always the easiest because it does require self-reflection and empathy and curiosity, but it also then has that reward of connection and, more authenticity and love and acceptance, safety, all of those things that I think we as humans are wired for.
Yeah. And, what we know from research from folks like Brene Brown is that shame not only doesn't help, it reinforces the patterns that we want to change. And Jeremiah, something that you've talked about in presentations around purity culture is that the shame when a person quote unquote crosses a boundary or commits some sort of sexual sin, I also put that in quotes, the shame can actually keep that pattern going.
That's right.
And we have to figure out a way as we move out of evangelicalism, as we move out of purity testing, to be accountable to ourselves without shaming, without criticizing, and without getting stuck in that self-loathing, which is so easy. We learned
Yeah.
that we are inherently broken human beings. That is such an intense self-loathing kind of message.
I like what you said about how shame can keep that cycle going. I wonder if you can share a little bit more about that, why that is. That's something I talk about with my clients a lot, but why does shame actually give us the opposite of what we're looking for?
Well, it reinforces the message that I am bad or broken rather than I said or did or acted in a way that wasn't according to my values. And if I internalize the message that I am bad and that I am broken, well, what other choices do I have? Right? That doesn't actually give me the opportunity to do something different. If I am inherently bad or broken, then I have limited capacity to actually make a change.
Yeah.
Also, shame keeps us in isolation. And if I stay in my self-loathing shame spiral, I don't have the opportunity for someone else to look me in the eyes and say, yeah, I've been there. That's hard for me too. When we can voice the things that are potentially shame inducing, if we can share them, we might be able to break the shame spiral. And then we can heal in the context of our relationships, because whether it's a family member, friend, or partnership or therapist, we do heal in relationships. And part of that healing is giving voice to the hard or the difficult thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious to know, even reflecting in your work with clients, like how do you help people start to do that, name their needs, desires, even their limits without that covering of shame? Especially since, many people that y'all are working with or that I'm working with have been told that those are things that make them selfish or even sinful.
I mentioned this last episode, but I'll mention this again. I think that the pacing is really, really important. That, when I'm a therapist and I'm listening to somebody talk about their experiences, whenever I hear someone talk about a need, like people will slip in kind of their needs or their hopes or possibilities. Like, I'll capture that and I'll either make a note of it or I'll say, hang on just a second. Can you pause that again? Because it seems like you just communicated something really important about yourself.
Yeah.
And my job as a therapist in that space in that experience is to hold space for the person to sit with that. And if they try to, and in my perspective, my way of doing this is if they try to talk themselves out of it, if they start to second guess themselves, so hold on a second, hang on, let's put that aside. I want to ask you to really sit with this and to help them have a prolonged interaction with what their needs are without some of these doubts, these shame, some of these messages of purity culture being able to come in. I become kind of a very kind, gentle, magnetic force field, kind of pushing those parts away.
I love that.
You handle that differently, though. That I know that you navigate that differently in the therapy realm.
How do you think I navigate it?
Oh, I think that you're more curious. I think that you lean into more of the curiosity about kind of the shame, and I think that that's a huge strength. Whereas for me, I'm like, no shame. I don't want to hear from you right now. Hold on.
Yes, I love this because there's no right or wrong way.
Need right now. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Your way is beautiful, and I've learned a lot from. I think the ways that you're curious about some of the psychological stuff going on.
Yeah. The other thing that I'm considering is how can we resist the urge to police others while also recognizing that we are allowed to have expectations for people? Because when you learn that the needs of others are constantly more important than your own, then one, you don't actually have the skills, tools, or resources to, in a curious way, interrogate your own needs.
Yeah.
And then you constantly minimize them.
Right.
I remember I saw a therapist in the Netherlands, and I was struggling in a friendship. And I remember saying to her some version of, well, I understand life is complicated. We're all going through a hard thing. So I don't really have any expectations for my friendships. And I remember her saying, oh, you can have an expectation for your friendships.
Yeah.
And I had this all or nothing mentality, right? That if I had an expectation for a friendship, then I was, putting undue pressure on another person, or that made me selfish in a negative kind of way. And so to answer your question, Laura, I'm thinking about part of that healing process is being able to understand needs, even expectations, not rigid or legalistic expectations, but expectations within a relationship, and then be able to navigate those together.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I know that's something I've dealt with in a variety of different relationships, that expectation piece, and also feeling tentative, like can I expect X, Y, or Z, from that person, from that relationship, and especially then when you get pushback. Because I think in some of in the purity culture standards, it's like there's something there too of like, if you're expecting this of me, like that's not okay either. Like I don't know, it's like something I'm working out in my head. But I think it does lead for people to believe, yeah, I can't have anything. Like I can't expect anything. There's something wrong if I do. Shame on me.
Right, right. So then part of that work is one, the curiosity for and with ourselves about a need. Maybe it's a need, or maybe it's a desire, maybe it's a want, maybe it's an ask. And then communicating that to the people in our lives, whatever the relationship. And that person may or may not be able to meet that need or request. However, so often folks from a high control context either don't do those things, or maybe they do identify the request, the ask, the desire, but then they make an assumption about the other person. They couldn't do that. They don't want to do that. They've hurt me before. And the work is to let that person be whoever they are. Maybe they will show up, maybe they won't. And you're still allowed to say, this is what's important for me in a relational context.
Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, reality TV is my, guiding light in so many ways. But I'm thinking of an episode of a Real Housewives show, and that was the crux of what they were talking about, is that somebody can come forward and say, this is how I feel. This is how I'm experiencing this situation. This is what my response to it is. And even though that other person may not like it or even agree with it, it is still okay for me to say this, right? It doesn't make me, just because you didn't like it doesn't make me wrong necessarily, right? And part of that is learning how to negotiate what is this relationship and how do we mutually benefit from it, or, what, maybe it is a readjustment of expectations. But yeah, it's okay to voice that and see if that person can meet you in that space, I would think.
Right, right. And when you do set up an expectation, maybe another expectation is one or both of us will disappoint each other along the way. And that's when the resolution and repair process comes in. The sign of a healthy relationship isn't that you don't disappoint each other or you don't hurt each other. I mean, that's a different version of purity testing. Our relationship is successful if we never have a rupture. Most deep relationships will have a rupture. And the skills to repair it are what we often miss in an evangelical kind of context, because we either avoid those ruptures, or when we see ourselves at fault, we self-flagellate rather than actually resolve or repair. The self-flagellation is such a bypassing process.
That's so helpful. Yeah, I think that disappointment piece, that's huge. I think that, we do get into these mindsets of like, you have to, show up for me this in particular way. And if you don't, that means something about you or the relationship, and it becomes irreparable. When in reality, it's like, no, that's just being human in relationships. Yeah. Yeah. So kind of to that point, what are some ways that you might kind of suggest that people can begin to notice when they're in more of that purity mindset, like in a relationship, versus maybe a more liberatory mindset?
Yeah. Have you read Carol Dweck's work? Have you read
I
her
don't
book?
think so.
It's
What's
it's
her book called?
it's called Mindset.
I don't know.
Okay, I think I can imagine the cover. I think I know what it is. Yeah.
She talks about the distinction between growth mindsets and fixed mindsets. So she says that we grow and evolve as a result of practicing what she calls incremental beliefs. The fact that I could change things about myself with some hard work, with some effective implementation of resources, understanding, of course, there are limitations that I have always. A growth mindset believes that talents can be developed, that limitations that exist have as much to do with limitations in capacity and resources such as time, money, privilege, as much as, or rather than it being a moral failing. A growth mindset believes that mistakes are part of learning, failure is an opportunity, mistakes are temporary, failure is temporary. And a growth mindset embraces challenges and welcomes feedback. Whereas a fixed mindset believes that intelligence, talent, all of that is fixed. Those of us who grew up in Calvinist communities or
Yes.
where everything is laid out before us by God,
Yes.
our job to find God's perfect will, that's a fixed mindset. Her research, talk about some of how this plays out in sexuality here in a few minutes, but in her research and some of the folks in her lab discovered that folks who have fixed mindsets believe efforts, it's fruitless, like it's either going to happen or it's not. Failures define who you are in these mindsets. So it's important then to hide flaws, to ignore feedback, or at least have a good response to the feedback, to be dismissive, and to avoid challenges, because feedback equals personal criticism in a fixed mindset, and successes of others are viewed as threats.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah. Yeah. So what are some ways then that as people begin to notice that, is it going back to the curiosity, kind of that gentle curiosity of like, hey, what's happening here? Or how might we invite people to kind of move out of that?
To me, the biggest thing that stands out about the growth mindset is that if I make a mistake, if I have a shortcoming of some sort, that failures are learning opportunities. To me, that's actually the biggest mindset, moving out of kind of the sin condemnation. And I have to like ask for forgiveness for God, that maybe God forgives me, but God's also like has a capacity to like send me to hell. Moving out of that and into, okay, well, that didn't go the way that I wanted that to go.
Yeah.
I didn't show up in my best self in that experience. Okay, I can have some grace for myself, to use a religious term. I can be easy on myself, not avoidant with myself, but easy on myself. And in that process say, okay, what do I want to do differently the next time? What did I learn about myself, so that if there isn't a next time regarding whatever the thing is that it is, I can still like take some tools and work on some things in other elements of my relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how can I motivate myself to come back into the arena? You used a Brene Brown example earlier. I know Brene Brown is a big fan of using
Yes.
a metaphor of stepping into the arena. How can I do that again?
Yeah, it's a very compassionate, like those are really compassionate questions, both for others and for yourself. As you're talking about that, it's like that's the frame that you're seeing everything through, is that lens of self-compassion.
Yeah.
The way that I define intimacy is the ability to both give and receive vulnerable parts to myself, whether that's information about myself or maybe it's my body in a sexual kind of scenario. And if a relationship can safely hold the ability to give and receive personal, vulnerable information, then I would say that's a marker of a relationship that has a liberation mindset.
Yeah. I love that definition of intimacy. It's a bit different than what did they always teach at church? Just like intimacy. I'm like, oh, your version of intimacy feels much more accessible and real. It really it doesn't feel so, I don't know, threatening or scary, at least in my perception.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. Well, I know we're coming up close to the end of our time, but I have a couple just wrap up questions. And the first one is if you could offer some sort of a word of encouragement to somebody who is realizing maybe they've internalized decades of purity conditioning or mindsets or testing, what would that word of encouragement be?
Nobody is perfect.
Ah, yeah.
That life is about kind of navigating the ebbs and flows that come over the course of our lives, of our relationships, and to remove the pressure from some of the like eschatological consequences of mistakes, and to view these as opportunities to learn information about yourself, learn information about like what you like, what you might want to experiment with. I've found myself using the language of experimentation a lot recently. That's connected with some of the liberation mindset, and to go easy on yourself.
I love that. Yeah.
I forget which one of you used a version of this phrase. What comes to mind for me is you made the best choices you could with the knowledge and resources you have.
Yeah.
I said it, but it's a Juliaism.
And I don't
Yeah,
think
love it.
I imagine that versions of that phrase have been around and hopefully helpful for a long time. So often we can shame ourselves for what we didn't know. Well, you didn't choose to grow up in the religious context in which you did. You didn't tell yourself that you were a chewed up piece of bubble gum if you engaged in X, Y, or Z behavior. So you were doing your best. Most people are doing their best. And you were doing the best you could with the knowledge and resources you had. And right now, you are still doing the best with the knowledge and resources you have. And those resources are changing every single day. I told Jeremiah, was it at the end of last week? Or no, this time, I don't know time right now.
What is time? Yeah.
I had several sessions with some couples and I was like, professionally speaking, I am kicking ass. I am very good at my job. Personally speaking, I feel personally called out by myself during all these sessions because I'm like, oh, this thing that I'm telling this person, I really fucked that up last night. And in X, Y, or Z. And so when we think about how our knowledge and resources are shifting, some days we will show up at decreased capacity. And that isn't to suggest that we don't engage intentionally, but some days our best will look different. And hopefully we will be with people who can say if it hurt them, not ignore that, but to be also say, like, I get that you are human and that probably you didn't mean to hurt me. And you were doing your best during X, Y, or Z time.
Yeah. Both of those are such compassionate responses. And I'm hopeful that as people listen, that they'll be able to take that in with that compassion, because it's so like the antithesis of what purity culture and high control religion has taught us, right? And sometimes feels just still embodied in us. And yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah. So my final question is just kind of what gives you hope about how these conversations are evolving, especially for younger generations in, communities that are trying to create new models of sexuality and relationship?
I happen to have a younger clientele demographic, and I have a close friend who's a therapist, and she has a younger clientele demographic. And sometimes we will say to each other, my clients are giving me hope for the rest of humanity. And yes, in the last episode, we talked about purity culture 2.0 and how Gen Z and Gen Alpha are taking hold of these really harmful messages and perpetuating them. That's alive, that's well, that's scary and needs attention. And we have a younger generation who also understands what I did not understand at 15, 20, 25, or 30. And when I have conversations with my clients who are engaging relationships, sexual and otherwise, with such a compassionate, human, value-based approach, I know we can do it.
I love that. Yeah, that's so hopeful.
Seeing a myriad of high school protests around ICE. There's somewhere in Minnesota, actually. And I think you probably have a little bit more hope in this particular conversation than I do, but seeing multiple protests of high school students walking out of their classrooms, student-led types of things, protesting, ICE coming into their communities, into their school buildings. That's an enormous source of encouragement. That large groups of people, of young people are working together to say, yeah, I do not align with this. I will not participate in a system that allows systems of abuse, especially systems of overt abuse like ICE is, into our communities.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are hugely hopeful. Yeah. It is cool to see the younger generations, pulling up the slack, right? For the gaps that we had. I would assume the same way that we pulled up the slack for the gaps in the generations before us. And I like to be appreciative of that. And thank you for noticing that and putting some words around that. It is very hopeful. Yeah. Well, this is such a lovely conversation. I always love talking with the two of you about anything. And so just as we wrap things up again, if you want to just share where people can find you, if they want to work with you or follow along, where can they head to?
Yeah, so for virtual spots, we are online. We hang out on Substack, sexevangelicals.substack.com. Our Substack is Relationship 101. Subscribe. We'd love to share some of our feedback, just some of the geeky things that we find out about relational health, sexual health. These are all the ways that I wish I had learned about how sexuality and communication works. I hope that we can give this as a gift of love to the folks who stumble across our page. So sexevangelicals.substack.com. The Substack is called Relationship 101. And then you did such a good job describing Let's Heal Together in the last sentence. Do you want to do that again?
If you are interested in relationship or sexual health oriented therapy and you live in Massachusetts or North Carolina, that's where Jeremiah and I hold licensees. And if you'd like some support around some of these themes and you live elsewhere in the world, we have a coaching business, and our coaching and therapy business both go by the name Let's Heal Together.
So learn more at letshealtogether.org. Again, we do all sorts of psychological services, but especially around relational health and family health. So
yes. Wonderful. Well, once again, we'll make sure that all of that information gets into the show notes, but just wanted to say thank you again for being part of this conversation. I always learn so much, and I know everybody listening will also be learning so much. And so, we'll have you back on for season 4, and we'll just keep racking up those episodes, getting the gold stars to Julia.
I know. I listen to a couple of podcasts, and they will introduce guests. And if the guest is returning, they'll be like, this is like a close friend of the pod or best friend.
Okay. Of the pod. Yeah, I love it.
Can we be Sunday school dropouts?
Yes. Yes. I will make sure that we start giving some titles out to the people who are the best dropouts.
It's not purity testing at all.
Exactly. Well, sometimes it's good. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
Just a little bit.
I love it. I love it.
Best, right?
Yeah, but don't tell anybody else. Yeah, you're the best. We love it. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you once again so much to Jeremiah and Julia for such a wonderful conversation. If you are wanting to get in touch with either of them, check out their Substack, work with them in a therapeutic or coaching capacity or consultation, education. They do it all. So make sure that you go and check out the show notes where you can find all of their information. Give them a follow. I highly recommend the Substack that they put out because it's a ton of really awesome information. But yeah, just go give them some love. Tell them how much you loved these episodes. So thank you to Jeremiah and Julia. And with that, all God's people said, amen.
Amen.